Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to today's Levin College Forum. Our forum series is a highlight of the college, and we really use it to bring in people into what we consider to be our living room here, the atrium. So please relax. We try to be as informal as possible, share ideas, and get some really good conversations going, because after all, that's what a community living room is for. My name is Bob Gleason, and I serve as the Associate Dean here at the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs here at Cleveland State University. I also have the honor of serving as a professor and the Albert A. Levin Chair of Urban Studies and Public Service. The topic today is the role of anchor institutions in urban and neighborhood revitalization. This is a topic that is quite close to the history of this college. This college, and indeed the university, Cleveland State, has played a central role in the evolution of the urban neighborhood that surrounds us. But we've played that role differently over time. When I first came here, it was 1996 as a visitor. And what I saw at that time was a picture of a university that had built itself without looking at its neighborhood, and was very much walled off and very separate. And indeed, almost 20 years after that, when our former dean was recruiting me to think about coming here, I slipped into town quietly, and what I saw was a transformed campus. Transformed in the way where only geniuses know how to go to the state assembly and get money for buildings that were already built in order to put new fronts on them so that they opened up to the community. That was just amazing. And what I saw was the physical expression of an institution that was really trying to engage its neighborhood, right, and to serve more than what it does in its classrooms. And I think that is a topic that is central to the history of why this college exists at Cleveland State. And indeed, when they write the history of Cleveland, hopefully 50 years from now, we look back at this era where many of our major anchor institutions started playing together and working together and collaborating together in order to build a dynamic for both efficient and equitable growth for revitalizing this one of America's great cities. So this topic is a topic that we have the honor today to have a speaker who knows a lot more about it than we do. Our speaker is Dr. Meagan Ehlenz. Dr. Ehlenz serves as an assistant professor at the School of Geography and Urban Planning at Arizona State University in Tempe, where I just checked. It's a little cool today, 65 degrees, yeah, but it is sunny. And have no fear, it'll be back up into the mid-70s tomorrow, according to the weather.com. But we really thank you for joining us on this gloomy day in Cleveland. Dr. Ehlenz shared with me that when she opened up the curtain today and looked outside from the hotel, it felt more like home than sunny Tempe, Arizona does. We can talk about that more later. But Dr. Ehlenz is here to share with us her research on, indeed, how anchor institutions, such as universities and medical centers, the so-called EDS and MEDS that have become popular these days, how do they actually go about playing that essential role, not only of thriving within their institutional boundaries, right? You can go into a building and there's a lot going on, but how do you arrange things so that that energy leverages out into the neighborhood and out into the region as a whole, to foster not only neighborhood and urban revitalization, but to help create real cultures of innovation, which are at the heart of the way we produce wealth in today's knowledge economy. I always hate reading people's whole list of things that they've done, but it's relevant to us that Dr. Ehlenz has a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of Pennsylvania. She also has, for those students who are in our Masters of Urban Planning, she's a planner. She's a real genuine planner with a Masters in Urban Planning from University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. But then she actually worked as a real city planner for the city of Milwaukee and out in the private sector for a number of years, before then moving on to research associate at the Penn Institute for Urban Research and a research fellow at the National Community Land Trust Network in Portland, Oregon. So with that as an introduction, I really look forward to hearing your talk today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me to have a nerdy conversation about anchor institutions, which is always my favorite thing to do. And I will say, so I come to this, as you were saying, from practice. I started out as a practicing planner and decided to go back into do more school for some unknown reason, and come at this from a research angle. So my research really, I like to look at this from a research, sort of academic, higher level theoretical side, but also bring that down into practice. So my research looks at a story of universities and what they do and how they impact their neighborhoods. And so within this sort of larger anchor institution discourse, I primarily look at two things. So I, one, examine the ways that universities have used place-based investment to engage with their surrounding communities. And then two, I explore the risks and the opportunities of that work for urban places. So you all are probably quite familiar with what an anchor institution is, but indulge me just for a moment. So the anchor institution model, this grows out of an absence, right? And here in Cleveland, all the Rust Belt cities, you really understand that. This grows out of an absence in urban communities. Corporations and industries, they abandoned their urban centers in the mid-20th century, and tax bases as well as public service provisions declined. So these remaining anchored institutions, the IPEDS and MEDS, were in a position to address the void. This particular map, this is the University of Pennsylvania, where I did my PhD. They were this anchored campus within a very dense urban neighborhood. So the term anchor institution doesn't really come into being until 2001, when the Aspen Institute used it to describe an urban institution with, quote, significant infrastructure in a specific community that is therefore unlikely to move. So these institutions, they're comprised of sticky capital, exactly what this map shows. Real estate, facilities, infrastructure, it's really difficult to pick up and move elsewhere. Also major employers and economic assets within the region. So all of this is to say that these institutions are pretty immobile, given their physical footprint, but this doesn't explain why they choose to become anchor institutions. What are the motivations that drive these universities to go beyond the fact that they exist in this place and they hire and work in this place to become active anchors and investors in the neighborhood? So there are a few different explanations about what are the motivations that drive that sort of behavior. The first two are pretty philosophical, and I'm not sure that they're necessarily reflective of the actual reason that anchors get into this business. But so philosophical reasons. One is that institutions have a social purpose credo, and so this brings community-focused values into their institutional mission statement. This is sort of it's the right thing to do argument. Another argument is that universities are motivated by the founding principles of higher education. John Dewey in the 19th century said universities need to embrace civic engagement within their communities. And there are things that grow out of this. The contemporary models of communities, university service learning, applied teaching and research grows out of that. But that's one theory about why anchors do what they do. The more critical interpretation of a university's rationale for investing beyond their campus boundaries, though, is ascribed to enlightened self-interest. So this is this idea that anchor institutions, they have a vested interest in place. They depend on their ability to maintain their own assets and investments, but also to attract all of you, the staff, the faculty, the students, to come to their neighborhood. And so this isn't necessarily coming from the goodness of their hearts. It's coming from the fact that they depend on that stability for their own well-being as well. Lastly, there's social expectations. The idea that local governments and communities have the expectation that universities, by virtue of the fact that they're public or they're private nonprofit institutions, are going to support their communities in ways that go beyond the knowledge and higher education process. So this brings me back to the idea of risk and opportunity. So on the one hand, the anchor institution model provides a great opportunity for town-gown engagement. There's a stable, committed institution that's anchored in the neighborhood and has a vested interest in the health of that place. And there's the potential for that interest to overlap with the neighborhood's own vested interest. This could be a win-win. And given that universities, more than half of them are located in urban communities, that also has the potential to be very impactful. At the same time, there's a risk. Institutions, universities, and hospitals are often among the largest landholders in their communities, and they have immense resources, resources that are far beyond what most individual stakeholders in those neighborhoods have, depending on the size of, or whether or not the institution has an endowment, the size of the endowment, that can reach into the millions or tens of billions of dollars. So as you can imagine, this gives them capacity to reshape what a neighborhood is in highly visible ways, but also ways that can shift the identity and shift the market conditions of that place dramatically. So this is what I'm interested in when I think about anchor institutions, this tension between risk and opportunity. And I've been working to untangle those ideas by assessing the roles of university anchors and then the place-based outcomes of their work. And so I've been exploring this through 3 broad research questions that I want to just touch on briefly today. So the first one asks, how are universities defining themselves as anchors? What do they do? The second asks about the big picture impacts of university revitalization on neighborhoods. And the third is sort of a more nuanced version of the second question, asking about different approaches and different strategies and what those outcomes are for place. So the data for this, I'm looking at a period between 1990 and 2010. And I do this because a lot of the current generation of anchor institution models, they begin to take hold in the late 90s, early 2000s. So 1990 represents sort of a pre-investment measure, and 2010 represents not quite a post-investment snapshot, but a snapshot in a period of time after the investment started. And then the data overall comes from 3 places. So the information about the kinds of activities an anchor institution undergoes, that comes from a survey that I conducted. And I looked at eligible 4-year accredited universities in urban settings. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The institutional data comes from the National Center for Educational Statistics, and the demographic data comes from the US Census and American Community Survey. So for the survey, I identified eligible universities by going through the literature and looking for any mention in the academic literature, in reports, and in university resources that a university was engaged in some kind of community engagement anchor strategy. And that led me to 64 institutions. I sent the survey to all of them. Then leaders at those institutions filled out the survey. I received 22 back, including 12 public universities, 10 private institutions in 19 cities. Here in Ohio, there's Cleveland, although not Cleveland State, Case Western, Cincinnati, Columbus, and Akron. And so for each of those institutions, I asked the university leaders to tell me what kinds of activities you participate in. And I created 7 predetermined buckets of anchor engagement based on the broad categories of activities in the literature. This allowed me to get a sense, again, of how universities define themselves as anchors, what kinds of thing they did. And so the 7 categories include traditional efforts, so investments in public safety, public amenities, community service, student volunteerism activities, and K-12 partnerships. And then there's this grouping of contemporary anchor strategies that have really grown out of the last 2 decades, and specifically their revitalization efforts in the areas of housing, commercial, and economic development. So the responses to the survey allowed me to get at my first question. How are universities defining themselves as anchor institutions, and what activities are they pursuing? So one of my motivation for this research question, there's a tendency in the anchor institution literature and sort of these more theoretical conversations to assume that the university and its neighbors, that they have the same definition of quality of life. And there's an assumption that when anchor institutions engage in this work, that it's analogous to a rising tide that lifts all the boats. But I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and I knew that things felt different to the neighbors there. So in West Philly, the neighbors and the student newspapers would often and continue to talk about the petrification of the neighborhood. And so they really cast the university's revitalization efforts as fairly self-serving, even as that money has brought a very successful public school into the neighborhood, a lot of other amenities. But it's not a black and white issue, and so that's the genesis of my interest in this question. So I looked at the survey responses I collected, and I compared them against two of the major frameworks for anchor institution efforts. One coming out of the Democracy Collaborative, the Anchor Dashboard, the other coming out of ICIC and their Anchor Action Agenda. So these frameworks say, these are the kinds of things that exist when the anchor model. This is why they do what they do. And they're useful. They provide a number of opportunities that the anchor has to intersect with and expand community benefits. That's really positive. And they tend to be normative, saying, this is where we could go. This is a shared value model of engagement of where we are headed. However, they're not particularly good at capturing the snapshot in time, what's happening now, how are universities actually defining their roles right now. So based on my survey, I found that universities reported a lot more variation. This table's really busy, but let me tell you exactly what I want you to look at with this. So the green columns, these are recorded responses for activities in revitalization, those contemporary strategies, and there's a lot going on there. The columns to the right in gray, these are the more traditional engagement strategies. So I show you this table for the following reason. In the survey responses, a majority of the universities reported active engagement in those traditional activities, the gray columns there. So education outreach, student volunteerism, community partnerships. But they're also doing a whole lot of activity in those three green columns there, including efforts in housing, commercial, and economic development. Why does this matter? Well, the contemporary frameworks don't adequately account for those green columns. They tend to undercount the investments in housing and commercial, and they tend to sort of reshape some of the economic development activities, the frameworks versus the way these institutions are actually pursuing them. So it becomes really difficult to understand the place-based impact if you don't know the full spectrum of this effort. So I've proposed a new typology as part of this theory-practice gap, and it responds to the multitude of ways these different institutions are defining their efforts. So there are two indicators within the typology. One is about diversification, the breadth of anchor activities that a university pursues. And so on the low end, you pursue fewer than 4 of the 7 key strategies. Moderate efforts include 4 to 5 strategies, and highly diverse initiative includes 6 or more. Second, there's an indicator for place-based revitalization. The idea with this is that you want to identify places who are investing in bricks and mortar projects in housing and commercial, because that's often, in the context of my survey, that is often what universities say they are doing. And when it comes to housing and commercial, they're not doing as much in sort of the incentive or rehab side of things. They're doing a lot of bricks and mortar investment. So this is the table of my typology with the 22 universities that I had in my survey. So when you organize them this way, you get 8 universities at the top of the slide. These institutions are pursuing highly diverse strategies, and all of them are pursuing project-based investments. 11 universities in the middle are taking a more moderate approach, and about half of them pursue place-based projects. And then 3 university anchors at the bottom are have much more focused efforts with limited diversification and only 1 place-based effort among them. So the utility of the typology is twofold. First and foremost, this is derived from the ways that institutions are actually pursuing their work. And it offers new insights into the model, identifying differences between the theory and the practice. And it offers a frame for assessing the ways universities interpret their anchor approaches. So it'd be possible with this typology to really say, I want to compare and contrast highly intensive strategies. I want to look among high endowment schools. So let's look at Penn, Harvard, and Duke. What do they do? What are the outcomes for that neighborhood? What's the impact in place? Or you could stratify public universities and say, well, what difference does it make if I invest in a highly diverse strategy versus something that's more limited on the low end? So you could look at OSU, University of Cincinnati, and University of Akron, for instance, same state, 3 different models of intensities of the model. Secondly, this typology can be used as a complement with the deductive frameworks from ICIC and the Democracy Collaborative. So whereas this typology looks at the current work as it's being done, you can then layer on these frameworks to say, okay, where could we improve? Where do we want to go? And how could we tweak what we're currently doing? So that's sort of the theory piece of this, the foundation piece of this. Let's move forward into the results. So this brings us to sort of a so what question. So what if universities are adopting these anchor strategies in their neighborhoods? Has it mattered at all? And so I want to talk about my results from first a national perspective, looking at all 22 universities, but then go down into certain types of cities and anchor strategies. So the remaining analysis, it uses census tracts, and I'm happy to provide more details about this if any of you are wonky enough to want them. But we have 210 census tracts located within university target neighborhoods, and then I compare them against all remaining census tracts within each of those counties where these institutions were located. So that's about 5,000 tracts. And I can say on average, the average university targeted 10 census tracts, so you get a size of the scale, but it ranged between 3 and 27. So looking at this nationally, what do I find? The first takeaway is that university neighborhoods are inherently different, both in 1990 and in 2010, than other neighborhoods in those same regions. So this is a table of descriptive statistics, again, 1990 and 2010, and it compares the university neighborhood group to the other neighborhood group. So based on the numbers, the university neighborhood group was more diverse, though that diversity lessened quite a bit over the 20 years, had higher rates of educational attainment and poverty, lower median household incomes, and a substantially greater share of renters. None of this is surprising, right? These are university neighborhoods. These are the kinds of things we would typically associate with a university neighborhood. More cash-poor students, a greater population of education-rich grad students, and then this mix of middle to upper income employees in these town-gown communities. But that said, when you look beyond socioeconomics, there's some pretty dramatic changes just looking at descriptives for the housing markets in these neighborhoods. So 2 graphs on the screen, one is for median home values, the other is for median rents. In blue, we have the 1990 values, and in orange is the 2010 values. So what do we see here? In home values and in rents, neighborhoods with university revitalization increased at almost double the rate of the other neighborhood group over time. So if we look at rents, the university neighborhoods became more expensive. In 1990, the rent gap between the two groups was about $80. By 2010, there was only an $18 difference, and it had increased by 15% within the university group alone, so it was about $115 more in rent. For home values, this change was much more dramatic. So in 1990, the median cost of buying a home was more or less equal between the two groups. It was about $10,000 less to buy into the university neighborhood group. 20 years later, you had to part with a lot more cash to buy into that university neighborhood group. So the median home value there increased by 86%. This is relative to a 39% appreciation rate on the other neighborhood group. And it now costs $60,000 more to buy into the university neighborhood group. So university neighborhoods are different, and based on the descriptive statistics, it seems like the housing markets are especially different. But then the question is it significant? So I use difference in difference modeling to understand, to look between 1990 and 2010, did the university neighborhood group, did the trends move in a way that was distinct from the other neighborhood group, given that using that as sort of an overall baseline trend. So this slide, it looks at median home value in 2010 dollars. And again, I'm interested in the behavior of the university group, if it moved in ways, the trend moves in ways that are different than the other group. So the mean median values, that's what this graph shows. And it shows the university group in the dashed line, and it appears that yes, it moved in different ways, right? You see that the two lines almost come together, and it moves in a statistically significantly different way. So if we take a minute to look at the difference in difference table and understand the magnitude of that change, in 1990, the university neighborhood group, it was the mean median home value was 26% lower than the other neighborhood group. That's the space coefficient. So the time coefficient tells us that just among the other neighborhood group, the appreciation was about 1% over 20 years. It was pretty static. The interaction coefficient tells us this was different for university neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods experienced 24% more growth than the other neighborhood group and closed that gap altogether. So if we do the same graph for rent, it's a very similar trend. So the graph suggests that the university neighborhood group rents came much closer to the other neighborhood group. And we look at the difference in difference model. In 1990, the mean median rent for the university group was 20% lower. The time coefficient tells us that the other neighborhood group appreciated modestly over 20 years, about 4.5% increase. But the interaction coefficient tells us that the university group had 10% additional appreciation over that same time. So essentially the story that we see here is that the university neighborhood group, it started out lower, but they caught up with the Joneses over that 20-year period. The story's different when you look at the socioeconomics. So I used the same difference in difference model to look at those trends over time and see if there were those gap eliminating patterns. By and large, as you can see from each of these graphs, the relationship stayed pretty stable between the two groups over the 20 years. So what does this suggest? First, it tells us that the university neighborhood group remained economically distinct from the other groups over time. And that's not surprising because they also remained target areas for students. They had a much larger rental market than the other areas did for the most part. But it also leaves us with a question about who is buying that more expensive housing that we see in the other analyses. And so one plausible explanation that has played out in my case study work, as well as just press accounts of change in these various neighborhoods, is that university neighborhoods are seeing their populations bifurcate. So you are seeing the student base remaining strong and growing as the neighborhood becomes more stable, the institution becomes more attractive. But on the other end of the spectrum, you're seeing a shift in those non-student households, and they're shifting into a higher income group who's looking for a vibrant urban neighborhood. So the last sort of research question is, what about the context? The national story is interesting, but that doesn't tell you anything about what happened in Cleveland or in Philly or in Phoenix. So I talked about the typology, and this is a repeat of the typology I introduced earlier. And so it stands to reason that the University of Pennsylvania, with a highly diverse strategy in the city of Philadelphia, which is on an upswing, will have a different kind of impact than University of Cincinnati will have in the uptown neighborhood, than University of Nebraska at Omaha will have in its neighborhood. And so the question of variation, I look at both the type of strategy that the institution had as well as the strength of the market overall using population and housing market trends. So Boston versus Memphis versus Akron, that's going to be different. So when I assess difference in different tests for median home values at the city level, there are two findings. Finding one, in most cities, the mean median home values for university neighborhood fell below the other group in 1990. That tracks with the national story. And so on average, you see between $427,000 and $143,000 less in the median home value, with the exception of 5 cities highlighted in green, where the university housing markets were already more expensive. So second finding, over time and in line with the national finding, those median home values were quite different. They behaved differently in the university neighborhood group. So over 20 years, you see most of those cities in the university neighborhood group, you see them have substantially more growth, or in one instance, less decline relative to other places. And so again, we look at this time coefficient. This time coefficient tells us that for the larger trend we'd expect in the other neighborhoods, most neighborhoods appreciated between 1990 and 2010. But when we look at the interaction coefficient, it says the university neighborhoods did better. They went above and beyond in most university neighborhoods, not all. And it was statistically significant in 10 of those cities. So if you break it down a little further and talk about how much appreciation did these neighborhoods see, in cities where there was a strong overall market, in your Bostons, for instance, on average you see $83,000 more appreciation in those university targeted neighborhoods. In the moderate market cities, you see an average of $42,000 extra dollars in appreciation, and in weak markets, it's mixed. And so the average appreciation, the additional appreciation was $684, but that didn't track in all cities. In some places, the university neighborhood groups performed less well. So these trends, it's worth noting that they are durable. They happened across all 19 cities, regardless of the way the university pursued university or neighborhood revitalization. And what does this mean? So it means that regardless of what the institution does, the fact that they're engaged in their neighborhood and that they're participating in revitalization in this way, there's a correlation with some kind of meaningful market change. And those shifts and the way those markets are changing, they're distinct from the rest of the area. Let's go one step further, though, and look for patterns in housing market change within certain types of cities and among certain types of strategies to see if we can identify the circumstances that align with neighborhood appreciation. And so the answer is yes, we can do this. When I look at the difference in difference models for the different types of cities and anchor approaches, there do appear to be some circumstances where universities are more successful than not. So the two ingredients I found, the first ingredient for success comes from the strength of the city overall. In cases where the city market was strong, it didn't matter what the university did. The fact that the university did anything at all in a very strong overall city market meant that they were able to harness some of that momentum and they were boosted up regardless of what they specifically did. So they didn't have to invest in bricks and mortar housing or any of that. They realized the benefit anyway. However, it's different for other kinds of cities. So specifically, more diverse strategy that included place-based investments really mattered, particularly in moderate and weak market cities. So in this case, universities who invested in housing or commercial projects and incorporated those into a highly diverse strategy, so somewhere between 6 or 7 of those anchor institution strategies, they saw significant appreciation in their median home values. And again, it was true regardless of the kind of market they were in. They didn't get the boost from the city, but they still saw improvement. So last slide here before our panel discussion. And I want to just close the discussion of what this work means for universities and for neighborhoods. So among university leaders and among advocates of this work, there's a consensus that the fortunes of the university are tied, at least in part, to the fortunes of their neighborhoods. And that's why we do what we do. We were talking earlier about Cleveland State and how you've opened up a lot of the first floors of your buildings. You've created this more porous campus, this more holistic neighborhood identity. And this is in part because you're an anchor institution. This is part of what that means. So my research takes us a step further and argues that university anchors, by becoming invested in their neighborhood, they're actively changing those places. So over 20 years, I've shown you the data to show that they've reversed shortfalls in neighborhoods, they've accelerated housing market appreciation, and they've really eliminated differences that had previously existed between the university areas and the other groups. And it mattered where a city has a strong market, it didn't matter what they did. In moderate and weak market cities, it did matter, and being able to really invest in the place-based strategy boosted those places. At the same time, the socioeconomic indicators suggest that everything is not moving together. The housing market is separating from socioeconomic improvement in these areas, and it suggests that instead we're seeing this reshuffling at the ends of the spectrum. And so the amenity-rich university neighborhoods, as they seek to compete with their institutions, bring students in, that's attracting students to those places, and it's moving campuses away from the commuter campus model. At the other end, these improved housing markets, these improved commercial districts and more vibrant areas are also attracting middle and upper income households, professionals and families who want to be in these neighborhoods, and they can afford the more expensive home ownership prices that come along with it. And so collectively, it suggests that these findings highlight the potential of anchor institutions to meaningfully change place, But I think one of the things that we haven't quite figured out yet, and it's not just in the anchor institution model, it's university place-based revitalization at large, is finding ways to match that growth to the socioeconomic improvement and really make sure that you can have some of that growth and wealth in place. But secondly, finding a way to preserve student and non-student household, preserve affordable housing for student and non-student households in some of these places. Depending on the city you're in, Philadelphia, the housing there, the homeownership housing has increased by like $150,000 in the span of a few years. That's perhaps not the case in Cleveland, it's not the case in Akron, but those are some of the real challenges that are coming down the pike with these investments. So with that, I will turn it over to the panel conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts. Thanks.
Actually, there was a unfounded situation at the Cleveland Clinic Medina facility. So one of our presenters that was to join us on the panel was Andrea Jacobs, who is the head of their operations. She, at the last minute, was not able to join us. But we do have two other panelists with us. The first, going down the line here, is Dan Busey, who's the Director of Government Relations for University Hospitals. Dan is the primary advocate in Columbus before the General Assembly and the Governor's Office for UH. He works with the elected officials and agency personnel and striving to ensure that UH physicians and staff can fulfill the system's mission to heal, teach, and discover. Before joining UH, Dan led the federal government relations for Metro Health, our public hospital system here in Cleveland. And before that, practiced law for 5 years with the law firm Thompson Hine. Prior to returning back to Cleveland, he lived and worked in D.C. for 9 years, was a staff member on Capitol Hill, primarily for then Congressman, now Senator Rob Portman. He served 2 years in the George W. Bush White House at the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Dan lives in Avon Lake with his wife and 2 daughters, graduate of Ohio University with a BA in political science and his law degree from George Mason. He's very active in his community on various boards and passed on the city council as well. And on your right of Dan, we have Mark Levin, who is the pretty new executive director, 8 months, I believe you said? All right, of Campus District, located right here in the Levin College. He has over 12 years of planning, administration, development, and marketing experience in the nonprofit and private sectors. Prior to joining Campus District, he was the Director of Operations for the Downtown Cleveland Alliance and supervised the Business Improvement District, the BID, located just to our west. He has a BA in Political Science and International Studies from Baldwin-Wallace, and he is a resident of West Park, where he resides with his wife and young son, so we are neighbors. So with that, I invite anyone from the audience who has any questions to please feel free. Molly, do we have question cards? Nope. We're going to just use the microphone today. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know, and I will pop down with a microphone. But just to get us started, kind of break the ice here. Meagan, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate learning your perspectives on everything and seeing the data behind everything. Next time I want to make sure Cleveland State's in the study, though. So just a little plug for that one.
Me too, I sent it.
I know. We got to get it to the right people next time. So we'll get that all figured out. You talked a lot about place-based investing. How does investing in people figure into things? You know, we can look at investing in places, but we also have to look at investing in our actual neighbors.
So in the survey, which, you know, again, it's 22 universities, but in the survey, I looked at that, specifically in the economic development category, looking at the idea of procuring locally, local workforce development efforts, and then hiring. And what I found was a number of institutions, they do pursue this work. And it's still, you know, it's hard to sort of figure out the logistics within the institution, and so it's sort of a work in progress. But one of the really interesting things I found, particularly among public institutions, is that they would say, well, yeah, we have local procurement, but it was actually mandated. So University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee is a good example. It's mandated at the state level when you're a public institution that you have to have local procurement. But local actually means like a huge swath of the state. So that's not helping your neighborhood. That's it's a little different. Or you can procure from Office Depot, but it's like the Office Depot that's in Cleveland and not necessarily, again, supporting your local community. So I think there's still some snags to work out. The conversation is there, but I have not found that it's dramatically changed what's happening. And when I look at, again, the socioeconomics in the neighborhood, the wealth is not trickling down. It's not lifting those up. It's more reshuffling who lives there. So I think there's room to grow.
All right. Dan, do you want to talk about some of the different initiatives that you have been a part of in Cleveland and how some are focused on place and some on people?
Yeah, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? So yeah, investing in people is obviously very important. They're both important. But what we see, and I'm coming at it from a hospital angle, not a university, but I think there's a lot of corollaries there. UH, the clinic, we're neighbors, we're right next to each other, but there's a sense that the people that live in the neighborhoods right around both of our institutions, they see the front doors, but they don't see a way to get into those front doors. So UH started a program called Step Up to UH, and it was really meant to break down those barriers of getting people through the front door and getting that first initial job within the system, with the hopes of maintaining that job and then either getting additional education or training and then moving up the ladder through UH. So it's called Step Up to UH, and we had a number of partners. We worked with a group called Neighborhood Connections to kind of recruit potential neighbors that would enter the program, and then Towards Employment that worked with our HR department, our recruiters, to create the kind of the training for our neighbors. And it's been very successful. Over the last, I think, 5 years, we've brought in about 200 different people. And it's mainly in environmental services, nutritional services, and patient care assistance. And not only has it been successful, but the retention rate is just extraordinary. I think we're like in the 75% range of maintaining folks. So, that's just one way. I mean, there are many ways that a hospital or a university can choose to invest in people. That's what we did, and I think it's worked for us.
Great, thank you. Mark?
You want me to just talk about campus district?
I want you to talk about all the great things happening in Campus District, some of the people-based initiatives and some of those place-based initiatives that are happening around town.
Well, I think the campus district is unique in that we had a marketing task force a few weeks ago, and it was described that the campus district is the human district of downtown, the humane, the human services, the humanities, somebody called it. So I look at campus district one, on the place side, we have a lot of work we need to do to unify this neighborhood. So as we all know, in the 1950s, the neighborhood was completely torn apart with the inner belt. Our neighborhood is divided by I-90, so our anchor institutions include Cleveland State, St. Vincent, and Tri-C, but it is very hard to go between these three institutions. So on a placemaking side, that's the work that we're really looking at, is how to link those physically through infrastructure and placemaking. But on the people side, this is the district where you grow yourself. You can start at Tri-C and go to Cleveland State. You can heal at St. Vincent. But I think we'd also need to remember that this is the place where the people who are in the worst state of their lives are also in. We have all the social service agencies who act as anchors in our district. So we are really doing some people work really at the grassroots level for people in all walks of life and in all areas of their life. So I think we have a very robust mission here in this neighborhood.
That's great. Do you guys want to talk about some of the place-based initiatives that you have worked on? Dan, I know you've done a lot in the Greater University Circle area.
Yeah, so one of the goals is getting people to live where they work, right? Attract people into the neighborhoods. So there's a program called Greater Circle Living, which does exactly that. It's looking at physicians and residents and nurses and trying to get them into the neighborhood. And again, that's been very successful. it's been so successful that the funding for that program has basically run out. It's a good thing and a bad thing it's a good thing that the demand is there, but the resources aren't there. And that's, that's the thing. All of this takes time, it takes effort, it takes funding, and what it really takes is support from the top, right? I mean, the four of us sitting on this panel can talk about it and say we support these programs, but if the senior leadership of the institutions don't support it, it's much harder. We've been fortunate, UH, the clinic, and CASE, those senior leadership teams have been very supportive of the efforts that we're doing. So, you hear of UH in the clinic and the competition for market share and for patients, and that will always be there, that will always exist. But there are more areas than you would think of where UH and the clinic don't compete and they actually collaborate. Trauma is one, infant mortality is another one, and these initiatives are certainly one as well. So there's no sharing of or withholding of information or trying to keep secrets from one another. There's a good dialogue between all three of us, and it's very refreshing, actually.
Yes.
So I would be remiss to say I think the most important placemaking decision we made as a community 12, 13 years ago was to do the Euclid Corridor project. By going through Euclid Avenue and the commitment by Cleveland State to transform the campus to be forward-facing. I'm old enough to remember what Euclid Avenue looked like before this, not by much, but I do remember. And to see that transformation is incredible. And then I also believe that the investments made by my predecessor with East 22nd Street and Community College to make that link between Tri-C and Cleveland State is radically important. As we look to the future, though, I think taking that treatment from where it ends at the Inner Belt and bringing it all the way through the district, through Cleveland State, up to Superior, truly linking the three anchor institutions together is going to be vitally important on the infrastructure side. And then as we look at housing, I think the campus district is uniquely positioned to offer a different type of housing model than we have in the rest of downtown. If you look at the most recent downtown housing study, it basically has shown that as downtown has risen, the near west side has risen in rents. The east side, while it hasn't gone down, it hasn't risen at the same rate. And so I think we can start looking at offering scholar housing, workforce development housing in the campus district that will spill over to the eastern neighborhood. So I really look at that as the next placemaking opportunity for the district.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Meagan, one of the things that you brought up was the petrification of Philadelphia. How could an institution work to avoid that problem so it doesn't seem as though whether it be a university or a hospital, is coming in and taking over the neighborhood?
So another of the institutions that I've looked at is Duke University. So another really well-funded institution, right? And they're doing this kind of work. They've done it really, really differently. Durham is in the midst of a major urban revitalization boom, so it certainly hasn't avoided all the gentrification pressures. But what they did, I'll back up for a minute and say, a lot of these institutions, the reason that they moved forward, particularly with these really intensive anchor models, is they were threatened, right? The neighborhood was deteriorating around them. They couldn't get parents to sign off on the dotted line and say, sure, I'll send my 18-year-old to this neighborhood where there's been, whatever crime level. And so there was a threat to their core population. When Penn moved forward, they had a transformative leader, and Judy Roden, who was president at the time, said, all right, there's no other partner here. The city of Philadelphia was in the midst of a crisis of its own, so the city said, yeah, sure, go right ahead, go deal with your neighborhood. And Judy Roden said, okay, there's no one for us to partner with, we're going to move full steam ahead, use our resources. And in the midst of trying to do something to really stabilize the neighborhood, it has spun well beyond their wildest dreams. They never thought that they'd be this successful. Duke did not face the same kind of threat, so that made a difference in how they designed their strategy. They have a lot of acreage around their campus. They didn't have the immediate crime on their doorstep. And so what they've done is they've partnered with other community partners. Duke has basically acknowledged that we have money, we have resources, that's our wheelhouse. We are not in the business of rehabbing housing and, stabilizing this element or that element of place, but there are lots of people who are in that business. Let's support them. And so they've worked with Habitat for Humanity, a community land trust. They've worked with Self-Help, who's a community development finance institution. And in doing so, they've really had other people whose mission it is to revitalize without displacing people do the effort for them. In addition to that, they've had a lot of outreach, and they've built these grassroots community boards. So again, it's not avoided all of the revitalization, but it's not been labeled as Duke's fault in the same way. These efforts in Philly and any of them, these universities, these institutions don't operate alone, right? There's a market that happens around them irrespective of what they do. So it's happening, but Duke has tried to be a lot more sensitive. And in doing so, they've preserved a lot of this affordable housing in its neighborhood in some really pretty interesting ways.
That's great. Dan, do you want to talk about the work that you guys have done and the Greater University Circle Initiative to include neighborhood residents and their voice and avoid the onslaught of complaints from the neighborhoods?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Megan said, and there's sometimes there is that lack of trust between the big dog in the neighborhood and the residents. One thing that comes to mind with me, we just did. We totally moved all of our outpatient pediatric and women's health care out of Cleveland Medical Center and into the Midtown neighborhood. And it's called the Rainbow Center for Women and Children. And if you've been down Chester or down Euclid, you've seen it. It's between 55th and 57th Streets. So one of the things we did there is we had a community advisory board. And we brought people from the neighborhood in from the very beginning and said, what do you want? What do you need? Rather than, we're UH, this is what we're going to give you. And I think that has gone a very, very long way. That started back in Vision 2010 when we built our new emergency department in the Seidman Cancer Center. We had patient advisory boards that worked very well. But what we did at the Rainbow Center was basically that on steroids, where we brought them in much earlier, brought in as many people as we could from as many diverse backgrounds, and again said, we've purchased this property, we're going to do something, but what is it that you would like to see? What is it that you would like to utilize? And so from that, everything has built up from that, from the services that we provide to the artwork on the wall, to the Dave's Supermarket that's going to be going in right down the street. So I think if you take that proactive step and bring folks in at the very beginning, your odds of avoiding those hard feelings are much, much better.
Can you talk also about the decision to put that on the health tech corridor as opposed to anywhere else in Northeast Ohio?
Yeah, so the patient population that we serve is a high Medicaid population, and it's hard for anyone really to get to our main campus. It's not the easiest place to get to, and that's especially true if you're a pregnant mom, or if you've got a sick kid, if you have two sick kids, if you work an hourly job and you have an hour to get from your job to the doctor, have your appointment, and get back. Most of the people in this room probably have a job where you can take a half a day off and go to the doctor. Not everyone has that luxury. So we needed to make it as easy for people as possible to get to wherever we were going to build this center. So we wanted to make sure we had it right on a bus line, and that was a must. But we also wanted to be, one of those anchor institutions in that neighborhood. We wanted to be part of a revitalization, a rebirth, and we could have put it in Cleveland Heights, we could have put it in Solon or Strongsville or anything like that, but it doesn't go to, you listed the 4 reasons why people act as anchors, and in thinking about the Rainbow Center, it kind of hits on all 4 of them, right? It's the right thing to do. It continues our mission. And we would foster some goodwill by being in the community. So it's kind of a rambling response to say, we needed to make it as easy for people to get there. And we found that's been a real plus.
Yeah, it really shows UH's commitment to the neighborhoods that are surrounding where your home base is. Mark, do you have any? I know, we're back to, my original question was on the petrification of neighborhoods and how we avoid being seen as that big dog in the room coming in and taking over neighborhoods.
Luckily, I don't think that, as I've talked to members of the community, that mindset exists with regards to Cleveland State. Most of the community members don't see it as CSU is going to take over and there's no more identity. I think the apprehension with some groups I talked to, especially on the northern end of the campus district, is more of the conversation about the greater downtown growth will eventually gobble us up, and we will no longer be an artist community, or we will no longer be this because we'll be priced out. And because we're having those conversations now, and we're being very thoughtful about them, I think we're being on the front end of that. And we also have a good group of landlords and property owners in the district who are cognizant of that and don't want that change to occur, that petrification, CSUification of that. So I think we're being very proactive with it, and we're kind of taking the tail end of lessons learned to make sure that we're engaging with the community on the forefront.
Absolutely, please do.
I just wanted to say that what's so interesting, particularly with the hospital conversation, and I haven't researched the hospital side of the anchor institution yet, but what's really interesting about it too is that for universities, your main constituent base is your student and faculty, right? So it's a pretty contained constituent base if you want to be really strict about it. For hospitals, that's not the case. Your constituency is everybody out in the community. So I think that the models tend to be a little bit different, and certainly the thought process can be really different, which I think is pretty interesting. And it results in kind of a different form of the model taking place.
That's a very good point. While they have so much in common, there are some key differences as to where people are coming from and so forth. Bob, do you have a question? Absolutely. Here, let me pop down with the microphone, as if anyone can miss hearing you.
Oh, yeah, I don't need a microphone. I don't need a microphone. I just want to push the anchor analogy one step further. The analogy itself comes from sort of commercial real estate, right? Classic is a mall, right? A mall, well, we used to have Sears as anchors at malls. We don't anymore. But three anchors themselves don't make a mall. Right? What makes a mall is everything else in between, right? That are designed to create an ecosystem, or to feed off the anchor strengths. In the research you've been doing about universities as anchors, are there any good examples of places who have deliberately cultivated the rest of the ecosystem? What sits between the anchors and how that balances off the ability of the university to actually create a whole neighborhood?
Yeah, I think particularly among those universities that have the really highly diverse strategy, there is an example. The difference is in the mall, the Macy's doesn't own the entire mall. In the anchor, in the university anchor context, often the university owns the rest of that land. So it's a little bit different relationship. But part of the success of, if you want to call it success, but the revitalization in these neighborhoods is that it's not just the university. They're drawing in all the commercial districts. They're creating these entertainment districts. And so, but they do them differently. So I talked about Duke. Duke has these commercial strips that have existed for a long time, and then they've come in selectively to sort of support, they basically call themselves sort of a silent partner, and they'll support the rehab of a particular building, or they'll support streetscape improvements. In University of Pennsylvania's case, there were in the 60s, that ecosystem existed, and then urban renewal came and they tore it all down, and they had it as parking. It was all fenced off so you could be very safe. as you came into the scary city of Philadelphia to go to work. But so they had to create the ecosystem, and they did so. In the beginning, no developer would come in and do it. Penn tried to say, we're trying to rekindle growth in this area. Can we partner with you? We are investing in this in our campus. Will you build this here? And they wouldn't. So Penn bought the lot, and Penn was the developer for the first whole strip. So they, a bunch of restaurants and shops and all those good things. And then University of Cincinnati is one of the other sort of deep dive cases that I've looked at. In their case, they took endowment money and said, we're going to create CDCs. And so the community development corporations, we're going to sit on the board. We're going to create, I think it was 5 of them. We will be one voice in there. We will provide the seed money, but then they will create the ecosystem. And, it's been successful in some ways, not in others. It's been really successful in terms of creating a vibrant district that students want to go to, that people want to come down into for entertainment purposes. It's been less effective in terms of stabilizing the housing in the neighborhood in that context. So it's pretty varied.
Dan, do you want to talk about some of the Greater University Circle work and filling those empty Camelot music stores for us?
I was thinking more Spencer's, but
Okay, or Spencer's.
so I think it's a little different with the hospitals, just because you don't have the physical space to have those other industries right next to the campus. But I think UH and the clinic have both done a really good job of looking to the city of Cleveland and to Cuyahoga County for purchasing. So just a couple of the things is a joint mail facility. I can't remember exactly where that is. Is it city of Cleveland?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on the Case Western Reserve campus.
Yes. So that is definitely city of Cleveland.
Yes.
And then Green City Growers. I know UH buys a lot of our food that we serve in our cafeteria at Cleveland Medical Center from Green City Growers. A joint laundry facility that both UH and the clinic use has been very a boon for both of us. And UH works with a company called Owens and Minor. They give us a lot of our supplies, and we made it a requirement that they build their next facility within the city of Cleveland. So that has been brought a lot of jobs into the city, into a neighborhood that had a lot of vacant and empty buildings. So it's little by little. I think we're building that ecosystem, but it's just a little wider swath of land than when you look at a university.
Mark, do you want to talk about filling in some of those gaps?
Sure. Around the Cleveland State area, I think a lot of the businesses, the strategy has been organic with having more students living on campus. We're seeing a lot of the retail activity here. For a campus district, one of the priorities for us is actually to look at the southern end of the district and make St. Vincent and Tri-C some priority there. There are thousands of workers and students in that area. There's not a single place to eat nearby. So if we look at that corridor, I think that's going to be kind of a priority for us to say, I think the doctors at St. Vincent are getting tired of the food court, and there might be some opportunities there to do some interesting food and retail opportunities. And we may just start with that by saying, let's do like a food truck event for the summer to show people that there is a market for this, and to kind of jumpstart it. But I think we're in the infancy stages of talking about doing that infill.
Right, and we talk about looking at Cleveland State over the years. I remember driving down Euclid Avenue when there was nothing here. So just, the transformation here at Cleveland State, opening things up, and now we have retail and restaurants galore. So many more food choices than you're right. We see just to our neighbors.
You can still go to Becky's, and we still have Rascal House.
Right, we kept our stables.
Yeah.
That's really important that we did do that. We maintained our old standbys. Yeah. We have a question in the back.
Hi, my question is kind of relative to Bruce Katz's work on new localism, specifically in the context of anchor institutions driving localism in a way that is inclusive. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on feedback that you got on your research in that context, and what are those implications moving forward as we're talking about reurbanization, specifically in the Midwest and the Rust Belt cities.
Yeah. So in terms of this idea of localism, I mean, I think that's the anchors are all embracing that. They are all invested because of where they exist. They want that sort of local economy. They want to create that density to draw that in. Where I think it's a little bit different for universities is they're focused on the local, but you also, again, their constituency comes from everywhere. And so at the same time they're focused on the local, they're also focused on their competition, which is national and international. And so they're spanning this sort of odd hierarchical structure where you're trying to draw in students. You're changing from a commuter campus model to a very a residential campus, but you're not providing the housing. They don't have the space for that. So mostly it's changing the local housing market. But anyway, so you're trying to draw in these international students and attract those dollars because that's the way university funding exists. At the same time, they are embedded in this idea of new localism, but I think that the kinks in figuring out what that actually means at a bureaucratic level, it's hard. They're still figuring that part out. Because I think when you're dealing with an institution that is, you have, roughly 4,000 students here. My institution, we have, depending on how you count the numbers, 90,000 plus students, and that doesn't include your faculty and staff. So when you're trying to figure out what new localism means and how to integrate that all the way up the chain in your purchasing and all of that, they're not there yet, but aspirationally, I think that we're there.
Gentlemen, do you have anything on that? Just want to make sure I don't step on any toes. All right. And our esteemed Dean Anglin.
Meagan, did you find that public institutions do this differently than private institutions in terms of their direct investment and ability to control the investment and placement?
Yes, they do, although I kind of want to pull up a slide. Oh, I don't exist anymore. That's right. They do. I mean, I think certainly the private institutions, a lot of them have a much bigger endowment, or they have an endowment period to work with. And so that's fundamentally different in terms of having the permissions to sort of pursue housing projects and to pursue commercial development like Penn did. They were their own developer. That's a lot trickier at the public level. That said, University of Cincinnati is a good example. They went out and said, okay, well, we're going to take our endowment and we're just going to earmark it for our local community, and we are going to let that be a seed fund. So it was not exclusive. There was not a hard line where publics really focused on, workforce development and local procurement, and privates focused on physical development. It was much more mixed than I would have expected. And I think that as the funding models again change, so again, I'm at Arizona State University. We are one of 3 public institutions in the state. We are mammoth. We are also located in a state where the legislature is not particularly supportive of higher education. So even public institutions are having to move towards more of a private funding model. And with that, they're entering the process different, and they're pursuing these development projects more often because they have to be more creative with fundraising. And then since that money is coming from elsewhere, they're able to use it in different ways. So I think that's an evolution that we're starting to see depending on how supportive how strong the local funding is, the state funding is for those institutions.
We in Cleveland tend to focus on multi-anchor. We talk about the Greater University Circle work, which is 3 large anchors. We talk about the work of Cleveland State here, which is ourselves and our friends to the South, Cuyahoga Community College, and St. Vincent Charity Hospital. Did your research focus on any of those kind of collaboratives or how any of those institutions worked across networks?
Not explicitly, no. So when I sent out the surveys, certainly a lot of them, I had asked, one of the questions was sort of who do you partner with? And a lot of the institutions did have partners with the local community, and so they would work with the local government to University of Washington Tacoma, for instance. They would work with the city government to say, okay, what are your downtown revitalization plans? They basically built this campus from scratch, if you're at all familiar with it, and so it was. Their downtown was pretty quiet. they had a lot of empty warehouses, and Tacoma said, or the University of Washington said, we're going to establish this Tacoma campus, and that's part of the reason, or part of how they partnered. That said, there aren't as many multi-anchor partnerships that are similar to what you have here. The Uptown Consortium, University of Cincinnati, that's another good example. There's some overlap, but not a whole lot in Boston. You have Harvard and MIT that are both doing a lot of work. They intersect a little, but not as explicitly.
Right.
So.
Dan, do you want to talk about some of the benefits of working with the other two partners at the table?
Yeah, so, I mean, we really have to. I mean, UH and CASE are literally right next door. The clinic is a stone's throw away, so just proximity-wise, we're all right there. But you also have to work with your neighbors, just because you don't have all the right answers, right? You don't have the best answers, and what works for UH won't necessarily work for CASE or won't necessarily work for the clinic, but maybe they can pick up a piece of that and use it, and vice versa. So I just think it makes good sense for the institution. It makes good sense for the people that live in that area, and the city and the county in general. So a lot of this work requires people to check the ego, and a lot of times that's the first thing that has to happen, and the hardest thing that has to happen. But to be successful, you really have to do that.
Well, I'm lucky to be now leading an organization that 36 years ago, the three anchor institutions decided that it was better to work together from the start. So the culture of this neighborhood has always been that way, that the three lives of the anchor institutions are intertwined. I think there's as you were pointing out, I think that it works out great because we are in close proximity. It's good to hear from other perspectives, but there's also so much linkages between the two organizations. If I think I forgot the statistic, but a lot of people who go to Tri-C come to Cleveland State, and so the traffic in there, the fluidity of the neighborhood just makes it important that we're all working together. And honestly, the three anchor institutions own most of the land, so it would be really great if all of them talk together on what their vision of the neighborhood is, because they ultimately control a huge destiny for everybody around it. And I lump in CMHA into that as well. They are a major anchor for us, and they own a lot of land as well. And to get them all in a room talking on a regular basis, I think is vital for the revitalization and the continued growth of the campus district.
Can you talk a little bit about Campus International School and what that's done for the neighborhood?
Yeah, I think the Campus International School is amazing, because I think for the longest time when I worked in downtown development, it was always like, well, they're going to have kids and they'll leave, and that's it. So you'll get them when they're out of college, they'll get married, they'll stick around for a few years, and then we'll get them when they retire and they want to downsize and walk everywhere. The Campus International changed that game, and I totally recognize that not every downtown resident is sending their kid to Campus International, but it now allows us to have that conversation like, no, there actually are good schools in the city. You can live in the center city and send your kids to school. So it's a game changer for us in terms of attracting people to say, don't flee to the suburbs once you get, once your family starts growing. But we need multiple Campus Internationals, and we need to keep growing that model. So it's also been great for us because it's a great partnership to have a primary school, K through 12 in the district as well, because we were always higher ed. We didn't have that here. So now we just need to get a couple more daycares. That seems to be the other the missing piece, and we will be a cradle to grave neighborhood.
Yeah, please do, Megan.
So that's the University of Pennsylvania. That's one of the reasons that their neighborhood has gone just crazy in their market, is because of the school. Because they have two schools, two elementary schools that are right in that area. They invested in one to build a brand new building. It's a public neighborhood catchment area. They have a $1,300 per student that they invest per year, that above and beyond what the state or what the school district trickles down in their budget. But it's been a huge ingredient to the success of that neighborhood, to the extent that when I was there, so I think this was 2012, it was January, it was, freezing, middle of winter. People lined up in tents on the sidewalk 4 days before enrollment for kindergarten started because the school was so successful. It made all the difference. And that was the last year they did that. After that, they created a lottery system, but it's really difficult to get into that school district. It's one of the best in the state, and that was not the case earlier. Similarly, University of Cincinnati, they have a similar problem with their, I think it's a language immersion school that they have. So yeah, that ingredient is huge at sort of making a neighborhood change, is offering that sort
And
of
if
life.
I could just, oh, sorry. If I could just give one more plug to Campus International, being a having young children, or child right now. I talk to so many people, I'm like, are you going to stay in the city? What are you going to do when your kid goes to kindergarten? And on more than one occasion, a fellow parent has said to me, well, I'm going to go for Campus International, and if they get in, we're staying. But if not, we're leaving. So that tells you there's a market there for this type of model of school.
And it really shows the commitment of Cleveland State University and our most recent president, Berkman, coming in, getting with the district and saying, we have a commitment not only to the students of Cleveland State, but to the pipeline of students and to our community to give that piece back to everyone around us.
Hi, I'm curious. So obviously, a lot of the institutions that you're talking about went from inward-facing to outward-facing, and that history of being inward-facing often is steeped in racism, elitism, and it's a huge culture shift to say we're going to become outward-facing now. And I'm curious, in the institutions that you looked at, were there any kinds of things that were happening internally to encourage staff, faculty to also, make themselves, their classes, outward-facing, or to embody this mission?
Yeah, I think some of it is, I mentioned this John Dewey call for civic engagement. And so there are these models of academic-based community service and, teaching and learning. I think that existed in a lot of these schools previous to turning out, and so that sort of already existed at an individual faculty level. I think there are a lot of examples of community outreach centers and partnership centers. I think some of the other ways, so I can look to ASU as one example, which they actually did not fill out my survey, but they hired me, so it's all right. I forgive them. But ASU, in their case, the main campus is in Tempe, and it's totally landlocked. They're kind of done. But they needed to grow, and so they decided, well, we're going to move downtown. And that the way they created that downtown the campus and made it successful and outward-facing is Michael Crow said, if you're a school that's moving down there, you have no choice. There is no opt-out. You will go down there, or you will not work here. That's kind of it. And it's worked. That campus now has 15,000 students, plus all the faculty and staff. The downtown has really turned a corner. I mean, I got there after it had already started to change, but people said, yeah, 5 years ago, we would never step foot downtown. But now we do, and they've built everything outwards. So I think that there's sort of the leadership, motivation, mission, value statement kind of stuff, but then there are these actions. The other thing I wanted to mention was some of these universities, though not as many as I expected, based on the frameworks, I expected there to be a lot more encouragement about walk-to-work kind of programs and investing in those incentives. It doesn't happen as often as I expected, but that's the other way they do it, is they say, we'll give you a soft second mortgage or a forgivable loan to move into this target area. It's been really successful in the cases that they've done it. You mentioned you've run out of money. I know Penn has re-upped theirs, but they've had to, the original target area is now so expensive that they've pushed it out into adjacent neighborhoods so staff can actually afford to buy. So those are it's kind of a mix, a grab bag of strategies. But
Gentlemen, any comments on moving towards more out-facing into the community and how that's changed things?
I think part of it too is a generational shift. So I grew up in a cornfield, and my parents would never let me go to downtown Toledo. Why would you ever go there? Why would you ever do this? And now, so then I kind of grew up hungry for that urban life. And so I think I was part of that first wave of people saying, I want to return back to the city. And I want to return for it for all the reasons that what makes a city great, and it's the diversity of it. I think it's very important early on to expose people to multiple ways of life, socioeconomic status, everything. And so it goes back to your earlier question about Campus International. Like, one of the reasons it's so important is it's very diverse. So students there are learning from the ground up how to interact with all different types of groups of people. I don't know, since I wasn't there, if there was ever an institutional discussion that we need to change it based on race and equity, but I suspect that the changing minds and the changing thoughts of urban life also have led to the fact that we want to be able to get into these buildings from the sidewalk and not pull in through a parking garage.
In general, a little bit of what Rachel brought up in her last question. How does race factor into the future of these initiatives?
So I can say a bit from my research, it's a concern and it's not something that's been figured out. And so I did a whole case study of University of Pennsylvania specifically. That neighborhood has changed dramatically. Off the top of my head, I don't have the figures, but in terms of the African American population, it has dropped precipitously in both the immediate target neighborhood and the adjacent neighborhoods. And again, do you talk to the university leaders? They were trying to do the right thing. Never in their wildest dreams did they think that this would happen and be as successful as it has been. But you see that sort of shift away from the African American population and towards dramatic increases in white and Asian Americans in those neighborhoods. I think one of the concerns that I have, and one of the things I'd like to see, is more partnerships with community organizations that are embedded in that neighborhood, but doing things like what Duke has done as an example of investing on the front end in preserving affordable housing, preserving places where these people can live before the market gets out of control. Because at that point, it's too late, it's too expensive to come in. And so doing things like a community land trust, I think has made a big difference. And again, it's not made all the difference in that neighborhood. There are all kinds of forces that are beyond the institution's control. But I think that goes a long way. In addition to these workforce development programs, identifying that pipeline and having those kinds of opportunities. But those are also really hard to scale up. They're fantastic programs, but I think it's difficult to figure out the scale.
Yeah, I think there's been a real acknowledgement of race when it comes to healthcare disparities. If you look at, maybe I do need to tell people about the infant mortality rate, the difference between African American babies and white babies. It's simply immoral is the only word that I can think of. And when you look at healthcare and differences in outcomes, about 20% of that is actual provision of healthcare. The other 80% are all the social determinants of health. So, like you said, housing, transportation, access to healthy foods. And so it's a lot to bite off at one time. It's impossible to fix all of those things within a year. I mean, this has been generation after generation after generation. So, we're hopeful that doing things like building our center in the community, being out where the people are, is one step that we can take to address some of those racial inequities.
Yeah, I think the campus district has done a great job of talking about race and equity in terms of this neighborhood and the history of it and what the future of it holds. And kudos to Rachel for doing those programming, so you teed up a good question. But, as we look at it too, I think we're trying to still heal the wounds of some of this. I talked about East 22nd Street, but to me that really is a focal point or a spine of the neighborhood, because the inner belt was deliberately put that way to cut off the African American community from the greater part of downtown. And this district is sort of the arm reaching over that back into the central neighborhood and bringing the opportunities of the campus district in downtown to the African American population of that neighborhood. And I think, so I look at, as a physical infrastructure thing, we need to bridge that link again, and not just with a physical bridge and a nice park-like bridge, but extending the trolley into Tri-C so that people can move back and forth between the two campuses and in the neighborhood. So I think it's at the forefront. And part of my bio is a little off, so I was living here but gone basically for 3.5 years. And when I came back, it's really been great to see that conversation be at the forefront. It wasn't 3.5 years ago, and we're talking about it, and I think it's important for all our anchor institutions and our CDCs to be thinking about that in terms of all the decisions that we're making. And so I'm proud to see the Cleveland community doing that again, or now.
All right, I have another question. So everybody start working on their questions because this is the last one I have. And then I'm going to just stare at you guys until you ask something. When we're talking about institutions that are continuing to grow, we want to grow and serve more students, be able to serve more patients and things like that. How do we look at growth in terms of service delivery and our physical infrastructure while at the same time fighting decline in cities like Cleveland? We're talking about neighborhoods that have traditionally struggled, traditionally African American, and have been cut off from these institutions, both physically and figuratively. How do we both grow and fight decline at the same time?
Honestly, I wish
In one sentence or less.
I don't even think that's the question, right? I wish I had a good answer for that.
There goes my plan.
Yes. I do think part of it, and perhaps this is optimistic or idealistic on my part, but I do think part of it is sort of recognizing that, I talked about this typology, that there's the way we think anchor institutions should be, but then there's the way that a lot of, at least for these universities, they're actually pursuing revitalization. And I think there's a disconnect. And I think if we can get closer to that should be model with redefining what local procurement means, so it actually gets into local businesses and not just businesses somewhere in the state of Wisconsin, for example. If we redefine some of those boundaries, if we can try to find a way to scale up workforce development efforts and local hiring, because it's really challenging and it's really expensive. And that's, I recognize that, but I think if we can try to find those avenues, that would go a long way in allowing for revitalization at a larger scale, allowing for a place to sort of revitalize in a more holistic way, and attracting revitalization in places that are declining and that have really historically struggled. That might be sort of a cop-out answer, though, because I think it's a really difficult problem that we haven't figured out.
Well, if we figured it out in Cleveland, no one told me yet, so that's why I was asking you. Dan, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I would certainly defer to Megan as the expert, but one thing that crossed my mind is the institutions have to make it a true priority. It can't be a tagline that they put on their website or on a brochure. And what helps, I think, UH is having the clinic and case at the table, and we see what those two guys are doing. Well, we can't just let them be the only ones, working on this issue. We have to work on it too. And, we're doing something, and then the other two see us, and it's peer pressure and holding each other accountable. So I think it needs to be a real priority, and you have to have accountability.
I would agree with that entirely and say that one of the things I worry about, and these transformational leaders that started these anchor missions, you've got to get to the next generation of leadership. And so absolutely, having that sort of built into your DNA in a real way, I think really matters. Because otherwise it sort of fizzles away as people retire or move, or and that would be a concern.
I think from the anchor institution point of view, they can play a role in actually stemming the tide of decline. I say that if you can get somebody to come to Cleveland, we can sell them on Cleveland. It is a great city, so we need to actually get outsiders coming in, more people from not Northeast Ohio coming to school here to see this to stem the decline. In terms of the decline side of it, I'll put my urban planning hat on for a second, and we need to stop building redundant stuff and use that money that we're investing in infrastructure for more lifestyle centers and malls to reinvest it back in the community and build ourselves up. So that's my plug. I don't know how the anchor institution plays a role. Maybe it's a Cuyahoga County master plan that shows an urban growth boundary. I have no idea, but something along those lines.
Do we have any more questions from our audience? In the back, yay, I don't have to stare at you.
Good evening. I'm glad you're all here. I'm an administrator at Case Western Reserve University, and I also completed graduate school there, but I came here as a resident. I have been in the neighborhood on the north side for pretty much my entire life. And if you've been looking at it, it's being heavily gentrified. So, you know, I have relatives that have been there longer than I have, and I've been there since I've been in knee pants. So we have a lot of households that are multiple and intergenerational. And so my question is, how do we empower people who intentionally stayed in these communities, whether that be through access to better employment? And the gentleman from UH, I appreciate the workforce development piece, but we have a whole bunch of professionals where I live. I live in the Wade Park Historic District. These are multiply degreed people, and it's always been really difficult for them to access these institutions as far as their careers. And the other question that I have for Mr. Lyman is, Campus District is adjacent to the Midtown Corridor. And a lot of people in these communities see that corridor as a bypass. The community is not being empowered by all of that construction. As a matter of fact, some of the businesses have closed because the construction has taken so long. So how do we empower people who are already in these neighborhoods, intentionally want to stay in the neighborhoods and want to stay in their homes with all of this that's going on?
So how do we empower the residents that are there who have chosen to stay, not those that, even though some may be trapped by various circumstances, those that have chosen to stay, how do we empower and connect them to the anchor institutions?
Can I, just one point of clarification, were you referring to the opportunity corridor?
Yes.
Okay, all right, just checking. In terms of that, I think our growth actually needs to focus more on the Euclid corridor connection because it allows for a physical connection between UH and downtown through a transit system as opposed to the opportunity corridor. So me personally, like, that's where I'm putting a lot of effort in attracting workforce individuals for the campus district is through those corridors and through community college and Cedar. I'm not actually that familiar with the opportunity corridor, so speaking on that plan, I can't really have a comment.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and you know what I think happens a lot of times is people don't even realize what the opportunities are, and so maybe we as anchors need to do a better job of going out into the community and saying, you know, look, these are the needs that we have. You know, are there people in your community that can fill these needs? These are the requirements. This is what we're looking for. You know, who's out there? You know, I know we're doing that at kind of that entry level, those entry level positions, but maybe it sounds like we're not doing a good enough job at those other professional level positions. It's a great point. I appreciate you bringing it up.
Especially because there's such a housing incentive for people who work at the institutions. If someone were to live in your neighborhood, take a job at UH, there's money to fix up the exterior of your home too, if you need new siding or new roof, something like that. So it's a huge incentive to want to work for one of the nonprofits in Greater University Circle.
I can just say from the larger universe of the institutions that I looked at, several of them have, you know, sort of community forums where once a month they have their community spokesperson and, you know, come to the meeting and share with us your concerns, your opportunities, whatever they are. I think that in the neighborhoods where that has existed, from what I've looked at, that's not been particularly satisfying to the neighborhood of residents. The one instance where I think that they've done it a little better is I will again point to Duke, because I think they had a different model. And what they did was they basically said, nobody trusts us. We've been here a long time. Duke University is referred to as the plantation by the local neighborhoods. So they knew that from the get-go. And so what they did instead was they hired somebody from the community, somebody that was trusted, that had been there for decades, that was invested in staying there, and that was the person that led all of their community investment and their neighborhood revitalization program, or he was embedded in their larger office that led the neighborhood revitalization program. So they felt like they ended up dividing their strategy into 12 different focus areas, 12 different neighborhoods. The man who led that spent months talking and sort of reallocating resources. But again, the university provided the funds. They didn't make the decisions. And I think that led to a different outcome. I am certain if you went to Durham and you talked to the people around Duke, there would be plenty of complaints still, because I think it's kind of a difficult animal to control when you have that anchor relationship to a bunch of individual stakeholders. But they've made some sincere efforts to at least try and really embed down into the neighborhood in a way that I think is unique and provides at least the start of a template for empowerment.
I think one of the other things that's happened in the Greater University Circle neighborhood, aside from realizing that some of the people coming in are coming from the neighborhoods and tweaking programs so that everyone can take advantage of them, like the housing program, is the work of Neighborhood Connections, which is on the ground, people working in the neighborhoods. And that brings in people from all walks of life to come together to talk about what's going on in their neighborhoods, kind of like a bigger block group meeting, if you will. And at those meetings, you have professionals all the way down to, new high school graduates that are looking for, connections in the neighborhood. So you get a lot of people connecting in that way. And through those programs, we've been able to share a lot of the work that the anchors have been doing in the neighborhoods. Did I see a question over there somewhere? Did I make that up? No? No in the back? Does anyone have any final questions for our panelists? I took my watch off. No? Nothing? All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ehlenz, for joining us from Arizona, and to our other two panelists. I really appreciate it. And come back and join us anytime here in Cleveland.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.